The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. You know what I can't stand the most? Posers, fake fans, people who latch onto something because it's popular, not because they actually like it. At first, they're not really a problem. They can be annoying because they really don't know anything about whatever it is they're pretending to like, but that eventually fades. Usually, they'll hang around for a bit and either really begin to like the thing or just move on to the next popular topic. But some posers don't move on. They sit. They fester. That's usually bad enough. It's enough to break a fandom, just completely ruin everyone's fun by this person dominating everything. But it's worse, much, much worse, when they try to co-opt things and force them to fit their politics. It's a thing of special magnificence, like so-called Tolkien fans bastardizing Tolkien's works to weaponize them against the people they hate. Such is the desperation of these fans that they perceive the villain race of orcs as representative of minority groups. Ironically, a few years ago, these same fake fans railed against the far left making the same association. My, how the tables have turned. Case in point, Tony Stark himself, Elon Musk, thoroughly failing to understand the Lord of the Rings. I don't want to give this man more of my time than necessary, so let's just get into it. Tony Stark has been on a bit of a Tolkien craze lately. He went on Joe Rogan's show and spouted some nonsense comparing small-town England to the Shire, and then repeated this on Twitter, where he said, and I'll try to get as close to his real voice as possible, quote, "When Tolkien wrote about the hobbitses, he was referring to the gentlefolk of the English shires, who don't realize the horrors that take place far away." Right. From the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past, quote, "There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at the time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves, who seldom walked in the Shire, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning. But they were leaving Middle-earth, and were no longer concerned with its troubles. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and the dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts, if they wanted any. As a rule, dwarves said little, and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries, seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy, and of the land of Mordor. That name the hobbits only knew in legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories. But it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to appear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there, the power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning, and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. In short, the hobbits knew what was happening in the broader world, they just wanted to stay out of it. That's what happens in the scene that follows that section, where Samwise Gamgee tries to convince Ted Sandyman and other hobbits at the Green Dragon that the stories they're hearing are real. The others think they're just fairy tales like they heard as kids. So, just to clarify for fake fans like Tony Stark, the hobbits live in the middle of nowhere, so they're largely ignored by the rest of the world, who think hobbits aren't even real, and they're happy to be ignored. They're not interested in conquest or wars, they've never fought amongst themselves, and generally get along with different races, although they do tend to avoid the big folk, humans. You would know this if you read the prologue of the book, you fucking poser. But Tony Stark didn't stop there. Quote, "They were able to live their lives in peace and tranquility.
but only because they were protected by the hard men of Gondor.
No. The Dunedain are the remnants of the kingdom of Arnor, which was in the north and no longer exists. Gondor is in the south and is still around. This is the first 200 pages of the book and the first 2 hours of the film. If you're a fan, how do you get this wrong? Oh, I know the answer, and it's not the weirdly homoerotic term hard men. See, Boney Stark probably only watched the movies, and he's thinking about Boromir's scene at the Council of Elrond, where Boromir says, "Long has my father, the steward of Gondor, kept the forces of Mordor at bay. By the blood of our people are your lands kept safe." However, that's not entirely true, and has a little to do with protecting the Shire, which is in the northwest of Eriador, thousands of miles away from Gondor. Those lands are kept safe by the Rangers, the Dunedain, as Aragorn explains in Fellowship, Book 2, Chapter 2, The Council of Elrond. Quote, "And this I will say to you, Boromir, ere I end. Lonely men are we, rangers of the wild, hunters, but hunters ever of the servants of the enemy, for they are found in many places, not in Mordor only. If Gondor, Boromir, has been a stalwart tower, we have played another part. Many evil things there are that your strong walls and bright swords do not stay. You know little of the lands beyond your bounds. Peace and freedom, do you say? The North would have known them little but for us. Fear would have destroyed them. But when dark things come from the houseless hills, or creep from sunless woods, they fly from us. What roads would any dare tread? What safety would there be in quiet lands, or in the houses of simple men at night, if the Dunedain were asleep, or were all gone into the grave? Yet less thanks have we than you. Travelers scowl at us, and countrymen give us scornful names. Strider I am to one fat man who lives within a day's march of foes that would freeze his heart, or lay his little town in ruin if he were not guarded ceaselessly. Yet we would not have it otherwise. If simple folk are free from care and fear, simple they will be, and we must be secret to keep them so. That has been the task of my kindred, while the years have lengthened and the grass has grown." And that last part is key. The Dunedain don't protect the lands out of a sense of superiority, racial or anything else. They do it because it's the right thing to do, and they do it without expecting or demanding anything in return. That's a huge contrast from the nonsense Tony Stark is going on about, where he frames these hard men as essentially men willing to do the dirty work. By the way, this hard man idea is another way of saying strong man, and when you look up which political movement constantly talks about strong men, well, I'll let Tony Stark himself give you a hint. Yeah, that's not the one you want to be quoting, son. By the way, Tolkien was not a fan of that movement in its Spanish, German, or original Italian versions. Oh, but Tony Stark wasn't done. Quote,
"What happened to the nice man who was brutally murdered while walking his dog will happen to all of England if the tide of illegal immigration is not turned."
Okay. So, you know how a few years ago there was this trend on the far left of claiming that Tolkien coded the Orcs, Haradrim, and Easterlings as racial minorities? Remember that? Because I remember that, because I made videos refuting that claim because Tolkien literally didn't do that. Now, this is where someone will quote letter 210, where Tolkien describes the Orcs as squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types, ignoring that the statement makes it clear that the Orcs are an altered version of what humans would look like, and the perception is based on a cultural, in this case, European, bias. They might also forget that both the Haradrim and Easterlings were manipulated by Morgoth and Sauron, who used their power over darkness to control these men and turn them against the men of the West. Tolkien repeatedly states that such was the enemy's power that even when they were defeated and long gone, their influence lingered. This wasn't just metaphorical, but literal. Morgoth's power lay like a shadow on all he touched, from the land to animals to men. However, the reason I'm bringing this up is that when the far left made those claims and people like me refuted them, posers like Tony Stark cheered me on, agreeing that the enemy's minions don't represent minorities. And yet, here's Tony Stark comparing those minions invading the Shire to the tide of illegal immigration, implying that real-world minorities are just like the supposedly evil races in the story. That's one hell of a contradiction. So, which is it, posers? I know what Tolkien thinks because he explained his positions in his letters. But what do y'all think? Do you think the orcs, Haradrim, and Easterlings are not representative of minorities? Or are they? Because you can't have it both ways. Is this what you think of brown people? Because y'all made the comparison all on your own. Nobody made you do it. That kind of implies that's what you think. So I'd like you to clarify. Even though I already know the answer, I've been black all 4 decades of my life. Indulge me. Also, while Tolkien's attitude on immigration is never made explicit in his works or his letters, there are examples in The Lord of the Rings where Tolkien talks about refugees, foreigners, and outsiders, specifically in Bree, Rohan, and the Shire. In all 3 instances, we're shown that fear and hostility towards outsiders either comes from ignorance or deliberate manipulation by the enemy. This happens in Bree with the squinty-eyed man, who's probably a half-orc, in Rohan under Theoden's orders, and in the Shire once it's routed. Saruman is behind all 3 of these. The half-orc works for him, he controlled Theoden and manipulated Wormtongue, and he took over the Shire. Now, this is where someone will mention Butterbur claiming that refugees of an unsavory nature flooded Bree. Yes, he did say that, but again, that was because Saruman sent them. These are the people the squinty-eyed man who works for Saruman mentioned at the beginning of the story. People might also bring up that the Shire had gates, but again, that's because Saruman forces the hobbits to make them after he takes over the Shire. Even with Rohan, when Eomer and his men run into Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, it's stated that the general rule is to allow wanderers to pass through Rohan as they will. It's only after Saruman takes control over Theoden that the rule is changed. And when Eomer tries to lay the blame for the new rule on others, Aragorn demands that Eomer accept responsibility for his own decisions and choose which rule to follow. It's tempting to misread the text and conclude that Tolkien opposes foreigners and refugees, but that contradicts what happens in the story. We're shown many times that hostility and cruelty towards outsiders violates the principle of compassion that's a major theme in the story. It also ignores the difference between perception and reality. In the real world, people, mostly conservatives, perceive outsiders as dangerous and a threat, even though the vast majority of immigrants and refugees are not violent. However, in The Lord of the Rings, we're explicitly told or shown that the influx of foreigners literally are an invasion force under the control of the enemy. This isn't a handful of bad apples in a good bunch. This is the enemy, Saruman and Sauron, intentionally creating chaos, causing good people to flee, and then hiding their agents among those people to sow chaos and violence. That's not what's happening in the real world, no matter how much people like Tony Stark want it to be true. Now, with that last bit about the English allying with hard men to fight for their survival, I think it's crazy that a guy who doesn't even live in the country is trying to stoke racial and religious conflict in England. Unlike right-wing clowns like Tony Stark, I'm not going to pretend to know all there is to know about the immigration situation in England or broader Europe. What I will say is, keep J.R.R. Tolkien out of this bullshit. He has nothing to do with this fight. Don't drag his works into this, especially when you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And just in case anyone feels compelled to claim Tolkien would support this racist bullshit, I'll leave you with this from letter 81 to his son Christopher, written in 1944. Quote, "We knew Hitler was a vulgar and ignorant little cad, in addition to any other defects, or the source of them. But there seems to be many vulgar and ignorant little cats who don't speak German, and who, given the same chance, would show most of the other Hitlerian characteristics. There was a solemn article in the local paper seriously advocating systematic exterminating of the entire German nation as the only proper course after military victory. Because, if you please, they are rattlesnakes and don't know the difference between good and evil." What of the writer? The Germans have just as much a right to declare the Poles and Jews exterminable vermin, subhuman, as we have to select the Germans. In other words, no right, whatever they have done. Like Tolkien says in his letter, you can't fight the enemy with his own ring without turning into an enemy. But unfortunately, Gandalf's wisdom seems long ago to have passed with him into the true West. Still, even without that wisdom, that doesn't mean we should give credence or power to war-hungry racist dipshits like Tony Stark. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.